My name is Diana Nichols Blumey. I am a registered nurse, but I'm not a mandatory reporter. But there's a good probability that all or most of you that are watching the presentation are mandated to report. And we're going to be talking about that throughout the presentation and why some of us are mandatory and some of us aren't. And it isn't necessarily based on an education or a specific profession. And we're going to be talking about that. We're going to start out talking about child abuse. Now the child abuse law is, we're going to split the time 50-50 between them, but there's a lot of things we're going to be talking about during the first section that because they also apply to the second section of the film, then we're going to address them right up front. So this first section is going to be slightly more than half of our time. And we're going to talk about child abuse and then we're going to switch to dependent adult abuse. When we're talking about child abuse isn't new. In fact, abuse of all ages isn't new. There are cave drawings that are pornographic. There are cave drawings that are abusive to people of all ages. So abuse situations have been around as long as man has been here. But as far as law is concerned and legal issues with child and dependent adult abuse, in our time frames, that is relatively new. In the first case that went to court was in 1874. And it wasn't even a human interest group that took the first case to court. It was the New York Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. And basically what they said is, you know, our kids should have at least the same rights as our pets. That was in 1874. Iowa didn't have a law on child abuse until 1978, 104 years later. And it wasn't because Iowa was so far behind, but it wasn't until the mid-1970s that any states actually started writing laws to protect our children. When we're talking about Iowa's law for child abuse, you know, we're talking about we have a specific code. You're not going to need to know the legal languages, but you're going to need to know what is included in that law. But something that's really tough to understand is the difference between civil code and criminal code. The Department of Human Services, Inspections and Appeals, Public Health, where I work, all of us are covered under civil law versus the Department of Corrections, which is criminal law. And so we should say, well, child abuse, dependent adult abuse should be against the law, and it is, but it's against civil code. So there has to be a mechanism to get it from civil law to criminal law. And we'll be talking about that as we go along too. But just understand, we're talking about completely different areas of our codes when we're talking about the laws. In order to have a child abuse report, you have to have three pieces. You have to have the child, you have to have a caretaker, and you have to have a circumstance. Now the definition of a child is very simply anyone under the age of 18. By Iowa law, a child isn't a child until birth, so we're talking birth up through the 17 years up to the age of 18 is the definition of a child. Okay, but if you stop and think about the different ages of the child, if we're talking about teenagers, you know, I actually love this commercial. It says, you know, do you speak teen? You know, most of us don't. If you've ever had teenagers, you know what it's like. When you were a teenager, you know the problems you probably gave the rest of the world. So it's going to have to be based on trust. You know, they want their own flag, their own anthem, their own nation. You know, they don't want to be part of us. And so here we're not only wanting them to trust us to work with us, but we're wanting them to tell us about an abuse situation. So it's going to be really a tough audience to talk about. When we're talking about our younger children, we have children, you know, if we're talking about birth and older, we have children that aren't going to be able to tell us what's going on. And so that trust relationship is going to have to be there regardless of the age. And so it's going to be problems sometimes of, you know, how do we get that information? Because we're talking about a wide variety of ages of the children. And then when we're talking about the caregiver literally is who is responsible for the care of the child. How many of you believe that educators, that teachers are caregivers? By law, they're not. Now, they are a mandatory reporter. So if they are aware of an abuse situation, they are mandated to report. But as far as being a caregiver, even though sometimes they have our kids more than we do, by law, they are not a caregiver, but they are a mandatory reporter. So this is really the first time that we see the difference between civil law and criminal law. What if it's the teacher, the educator, that is the perpetrator? Okay, because they're not a caregiver and there isn't a caregiver involved, they're not going to go under civil code for child abuse. They're going to go under criminal code to start off with. We're going to have to follow through with them as a perpetrator under criminal law. Sometimes we don't realize how easy it is for us to become a caregiver. You know, if my children are down the street playing with your kids, you have assumed the responsibility of my children, and you may not be aware they're in your yard. Now, if something happens, could you be charged? Well, it's going to depend on the third C, the circumstance. What happened? What was your role? What was your responsibility? Could you be charged? Will you be charged? Those are all going to depend on what happened. But then when we're talking about caregivers, let's talk about babysitters, because a lot of times a babysitter is a child. Okay, so now where is the responsibility? If you're talking about a child that is taking care of other children and they are the perpetrator, it's going to depend on whether it's going to fall under civil code or if it's going to fall under criminal code. There was recently a case in Iowa where we had a 15-year-old who was babysitting for a 7-month-old. Not only was he convicted of sexual assault of a 7-month-old, but he was also responsible for the 7-month-old death. So we're talking about, you know, yes, it was a dual investigation between civil, because we had a child, we had a caretaker, and we had a circumstance, but we also had a criminal perpetrator. And so it was investigated under both sides of it. But in the end, it all went with the criminal law. So say that I hire one of my older children to babysit for my younger kids. And say the person that I have picked to be responsible is not capable, is not mature enough to doing the job. Okay, now if something happens, depending on what the situation is, potentially I'm responsible because I picked the wrong caregiver for my children. So that responsibility is mine. But say you actually hire that same child. You hire my child, and if they're not capable of taking care of my kids, they shouldn't be taking care of yours. So now as far as who's responsible, you are. And so the caregiver can be a wide variety of people, and it's just going to depend on what happened, which is the third C, the circumstance. You know, what is it that you suspect? You know, Iowa law says it is our responsibility to report suspected child abuse. We don't wait until we investigate. We don't wait till we've asked questions. We don't wait till we've decided if we're going to report or not report. It's our responsibility to report suspected abuse. And sometimes it isn't going to be something that you see. It isn't maybe something that you hear or that you know. Sometimes it's really going to be that gut instinct. And I think most of us at some point have responded to that. It's what makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck? What makes you kind of queasy, kind of sick to your stomach? Sometimes that's going to be enough for you to just stop and say, wait a minute, what's going on here? And so the circumstances can be a real wide variety of situations. And we're going to be talking about some of those different things in a moment. Unfortunately, anytime a law is written, somebody decides there has to be an exception to it. And this exception makes absolutely no sense. You know, you have to have 3 pieces of the puzzle. You have to have a child, a caretaker, and a circumstance. The exception says, though, if you have a child that's under the age of 12, and they are sexually assaulted, so you have a child in a circumstance, but there's no caregiver, it's still going to fit civil code under child abuse. If they're over 11, it'll go criminal code. So say, for example, that my 11 and 12-year-olds are at a playground playing. You know, there are no other people around, and a perpetrator comes out and sexually assaults my 11-year-old. So we have a child because she's 11. We have a sexual assault, so we have a circumstance. There's no caretaker. That's still going to go civil law and child abuse. But my 12-year-old is also sexually assaulted. Same situation, same perpetrator. We still have a child, we still have a circumstance, and we still don't have a caregiver. Unfortunately, that's going criminal law and not civil. And so my children actually are going to be dealt with under 2 separate types of investigations. It makes no sense. Okay, and so just realize sometimes the laws don't. We're going to talk for a little bit about who are the offenders. And most of the time we realize, you know, we look at TV, we see they're wearing this orange jumpsuit or they've got black and white stripes. You know, we say, well, that's the bad guy. I mean, they even look like the bad guy. But sometimes we don't realize who else is out there. Think about, you know, personally, how many of you got up before 5 this morning? How many of you have already worked part of today? How many of you don't feel well? How many of you are tired? How many of you have a dependent at home, either a child or an adult? You know, and when I ask those questions, the majority of the time, 100% of the audience is going to say, yes, I fit one of those categories. Because 100% of the time, we could have that potential of being the bad guy. Now, as professional caretakers, you know, we don't ever want anybody to point the finger at us. But there are times, even though we're doing our job because we really want to be doing it, there are times we're out of coping skills. There are times we have absolutely nothing left to run on. And as a professional, though, if we step over the line, you know, obviously that is even worse than someone that is a caretaker of the children as a professional. As a professional, if we step over the line, generally it's verbal. We say something we shouldn't have said. We use a tone of voice we shouldn't have used. As a professional, we do not have that right. If we step over the line into a physical category, generally it's a tap, might be a swat. I mean, we're not talking about beating the snot out of somebody. Okay, but as a professional, we do not have the right to step over that line. But then what about caretakers in a home situation? You know, there are times that they are so totally overwhelmed too. I know in one of the recent flood situations in Iowa, we had a lot of victims that had lost their homes or their belongings in flood situations. The Department of Public Health sent a team of surveyors into one of the areas with flood damage to talk to the victims about what were their physical and their mental health needs. And I don't know if any of you have ever done a mental health assessment, but somewhere, it's usually pretty far down the list of questions, is the question that says, have you ever considered suicide? And based on that answer, the next question is, have you ever tried it? And based on that answer, the thing is, what did you do? What did you try? When the surveyors went in to talk to the flood victims, they didn't even get to the beginning of those questions, the mental health questions. Right up front, there were a lot of flood victims that jumped ahead and said, wait a minute, you want to know how really bad it is? I've thought about committing suicide, and I know what I would do. And so we can have people that are at home, parents, paid caregivers, like babysitters, child care workers. We can have people out there that, you know, it really isn't their profession to take care of a child, that have had all they can take. They have no coping skills left. The second type of offender, the person that is overwhelmed but ignorant. Have any of you ever had a job where they hired an idiot? Yeah, that happens. You know, and unfortunately, if we're having an economic downturn, it happens even more often. But we have people that are taking jobs for a paycheck. You know, they really are not going to be that well-intentioned. They're in it for the money. They have to have a job. Okay, so we may in fact have people that are being hired that have no business being there. We've got the wrong mix of people. Okay, but then what about orientation as a new employee? You don't know everything there is to know about an organization. You don't know everything there is to know about what your job's going to entail. What about students? Students don't know it all. That's why they're still students. And even new graduates. A new graduate does not know everything. Okay, so we can have people in a wide variety of professions, jobs that are well-intentioned, but they're ignorant of what it really takes to take care of a child. You know, this is the same scale when we're talking about dependent adults. So I'll just give you some difference when we get to the dependent adult section of how it can pertain slightly different than it does to child abuse. But then let's talk about being that well-intentioned but ignorant caregiver and talking about at home. What about the 14-year-old that's given birth to a child and has chosen to keep it? You know, they have only been a teenager part of 2 years. They have never been an adult. Hopefully, they've never been a parent. What do they know about taking care of a child 24 hours a day? And one of the classics that we see that we have Kool-Aid in a baby bottle. Now, I'm not knocking Kool-Aid. For an older child, newborn, no. We've got somebody that's well-intentioned, chosen to keep the child, but they're not doing the best job as a caregiver that they could do. So they're well-intentioned, ignorant caregiver. And then persons that are, you know, they are unwilling, could totally care less. And again, because of economics, we're going to run into those people too. They're in it for the job, they have to have a paycheck, they really are unwilling. And probably it doesn't matter what we're going to attempt to do, we're going to have a problem trying to change them over, to have them be responsible, to have them willingly do the job that they're supposed to be doing. Okay, so we can have the people professionally that we are working with that, are unwilling, could care less. But then let's talk about, once again, from a home standpoint, who might we interact out in the public? Let's take a single mom. Now, I'm not knocking single parents. I real please don't take it that I am. But there is a time as a single parent where that social drive, that need is there to be with adults instead of kids. Now, as soon as that decision is made, hey, it's time for me to get back out into the adult world again. The second decision that's going to be made is going to be, do I have enough money? Do I have enough money to pay for a babysitter and go out for the evening? If the answer to that is yes, I do have enough money, then we're talking about probably at least the attempt will be made to find a babysitter for the kids. If there is not enough money to do both the socialization and childcare, depends on how bad that need is, how severe, critical it is. It could in fact be that I don't have the money, but I still need to go out. So as soon as that decision is made, the kids are at risk. The younger they are or quieter they are, let's say they've fallen asleep early, the focus has already changed. And so the caretaker may have already switched from being concerned about the children to being concerned about the evening out. And so it could be the kids are at risk as soon as that decision is made. But then let's put her in a social setting. She walks up to somebody and she goes, hey, my name's Di and I have 5 kids. Most people don't go out for the evening to become an instant parent. Okay, and so the probability of her sharing that there are children, especially 5 kids, the fact she probably is not going to share that for a while. It may not be shared that evening. In fact, it might not be shared for several months. It depends on what that relationship is. And so this whole time you've got, not only do you have mom that is starting to slip as being a good caregiver, but that new person in their social world also places the kids at risk, because they may not be wanting to be involved with children. They may not care what's going on. So both sides, the kids are at risk. The last two, the abusive personality and the sadistic personality, these are 100% psychosocial deviants. Okay, and so let's talk about the abusive personality first. The best example I've ever heard is a flasher. A flasher goes like this, we go, ah! They just won. That is all they wanted out of us was our reaction. They don't want us to touch. They don't want us to interact in any way with them. They just want to scare the pudding out of us. They are always looking for an audience. And kids are the world's best audience. A lot of the times, from the time they're born, they're in a fairy tale world. I don't know how many Disney channels there are. But we read books to them that are fairy tales. We have songs that are about fairy tales, things that aren't true. We have got this thing that's got the big black ears. We've got this big purple dinosaur. We have a big yellow bird. We have fictitious people. And so a lot of times children are into a situation because they are used to being entertained before they realize they're in trouble. Depending on their age or their ability and their maturity, they may never realize they're in trouble until it's beyond the point when they can do something about it. And so the abusive personality is always looking for the audience. The sadistic personality is 100% about pain and control. The more that person can hurt us, whether it's physically, emotionally, psychologically, the better off they are. It's all about them, and they are always looking for a victim. And once again, kids make great victims. Dependent adults make a good audience and a good victim also, and we'll talk about those in a minute. The scariest news about it is that all 5 of those categories, we're going to find them everywhere we find children, everywhere we find dependent adults, including potentially where you work. You need to be aware of the fact that they are there. There are 10 separate categories of child abuse. Those of you who've had the class before, you know that starting in 2010, the 10th one was just added. And so we're going to be talking about them individually. When we're talking about physical abuse, we're generally not talking about something that's an accident. So you have a caretaker say, well, I accidentally burnt them with an iron. I accidentally stabbed them. We're talking about something that is non-accidental. And then generally there's that variance with history. So say that you have a child that says, Mommy shoved me down the stairs. Okay, Mom's just been accused of something, of hurting her child. She isn't going to be able to let that ride because she's the one that's in jeopardy with it. And so she's probably going to try to change our opinion of what was just said. And usually, sometimes it's that old adage about it's better to be heard, better be seen than not heard. You know, so the child is supposed to keep quiet, is not supposed to talk to the adult. But more often than that, it's something like, I am so sorry. He lies all the time. He lies about everything. And so it's, you know, that doubt is there. We're not going to believe the child as easily based on what the adult is saying. And then the word omissions. You're going to find the word omissions pretty much through all of the different types of abuse. And basically what it is that if a caretaker omits the safety, they're potentially just as guilty. Okay, so say that my significant other is physically abusive to me, and yet there's a probability they'll be physically abusive to the children if I leave the kids. And so I do. I leave the kids with a caretaker that's potentially abusive. When I get home, if my kids have been physically abused in my absence, you know, the perpetrator can be charged with physical abuse as the perpetrator. I can be charged with physical abuse by omission because I failed to keep the child safe. And then what is foreseeable? Let's say I look out here in the middle of a busy street and there's my 2-year-old standing in the middle of the street. Now, if I don't react at all, there's a good probability the child's going to be hurt. You know, it's foreseeable that a vehicle won't stop on time. It's foreseeable that a vehicle may not even see the size because of the size of the child. I don't want that to happen. So I run across, I grab my child, I bring him back to safety. And in the process of that, I scratch them. Now, that's not really foreseeable. That is an accident because every time you save the life of somebody, you don't scratch them. Okay? But I'm upset. You know, I just have run across the street, brought the kid back to safety. I haven't run a 100-yard dash since I was a senior in high school. You know, I'm out of shape. Heart's pounding. I'm having problems breathing. My adrenaline is spiked, and I grab the child and I go, what were you doing out there? Now is it foreseeable my actions are going to hurt the child? Yes. I'm really hot because we have a household rule. You do not leave the yard. I take off my belt to strike the child to punish them for breaking a household rule. Now is it foreseeable that my actions are going to hurt the child? Definitely. Especially if I reverse it and use the buckle end. And so is it a foreseeable situation? Is the injury foreseeable? And then the word observed or observable. You know, say you have a child that comes in, a 12-year-old that says they've been spanked so hard the night before it hurts to sit down. You know, we don't say, drop your drawers, let me see. We don't have to see the injury. It does not have to be observed to make the report. Based on what the child has told us is enough to make the report. You know, sometimes it's what we have heard about, so we won't actually see it. But the other thing that makes this piece of it important is that as long as the child is under the age of 18, so as long as they are still a child, they can tell us about something that happened any time in their childhood, and we have got to make a report based on what they have said. So say you have a 17-year-old that said they were sexually abused at age 14. Hopefully we weren't involved at that time and missed something. There's a good probability we wouldn't have observed anything at all because we weren't involved. So as long as they are still under the age of 18, anything they tell us about an abusive situation, we've got to make that report. Obviously, we would put into it the fact is they said this, that we hadn't been part of it. And so it doesn't have to be observable. You know, most of us that are especially in any of the social services, any healthcare fields, law enforcement, we are trained to ask questions. But as far as child abuse is concerned, as far as dependent adult abuse, it's our responsibility to report suspected abuse, not ask all the questions, not investigate. It's our responsibility to report. And as people, sometimes that's kind of tough, especially if we've been trained to ask those type of questions. But also, a lot of times we're not aware of our nonverbal communication. My dad always said if you tied my hands together, I couldn't talk at all. You know, because most of us use, you know, I use my body a lot when I'm communicating with other people. And so I may be talking to a child and I may go, not even being aware of it, I go, you know, did your mommy do this? You know, and I may not be aware that I'm giving them a verbal cue. Now they are trusting me to be on their side. And so they may stop and think, oh, she thinks mommy did it, and And so the child may agree to something that in fact it didn't happen. You know, it could have been the dad. could have been the boyfriend. And so we have to be really careful of our nonverbal language. But there are a couple questions that not only are safe to ask, but are kind of important to ask. One is, have you ever been hurt like this before? You know, that could be the 17-year-old saying, yes, I was sexually assaulted when I was 14. It could be the child that says, every time daddy goes off the wagon, I get hurt. Every time mommy is unemployed, I get hurt. And so you may find kind of pieces of that puzzle that's going to be important for you to report. But another question that not only is a good question to ask, it really is almost critical to ask, and that is, do you hurt anywhere else? It could in fact be that that child that has been spanked so hard they can't sit down may have also been kicked in the ribs. It could be, in fact, that the pain in the ribs, because it doesn't hurt as much as where they were spanked, they don't think about it. But you may be facing an emergency situation, fractured rib, punctured lung, you know, so in fact you should ask that a question about, do you hurt anywhere else? You know, I know this is very difficult to read. There's a lot of information on this slide, and the purpose of it isn't to strain your vision. The purpose of it is to show you that when we're talking about physical abuse, it can be a wide range of problems. You know, at the bottom we have scratches, cuts, and bruises. At the top we have death and murder. You know, they could be wide apart, but it also sometimes cuts and bruises lead to death. And so it doesn't necessarily mean that these are minor at this end of the scale. But if we're talking about minor injuries, usually we're going to see them as scratches, cuts, and bruises. We're not going to take all of the different steps going up the scale, but we are going to kind of follow in order with it. When we're talking about burns, burns usually look like what was used. A cigarette burn is generally a small round circle. Now sometimes we'll have a caretaker say, well, I was just flicking the ash off of my cigarette and the child or the dependent adult moved into the way. You're not going to have a round circle. You've got two moving objects. It's going to look like a comma, a hash mark. It isn't going to be a round circle. If we're talking about curling irons, generally we're talking about a long skinny burn. Steam irons, it's usually the pointed side used rather than the back side. If you see a coil type of burn, generally we're talking the top of an electric stove. If you see really wide striped burns, generally we're talking about your old-fashioned cast iron radiator heat. And so burns usually look like what was used. Rope burns, usually we find them at wrist, we may find them at ankles, around the neck. We may find various parts of the body that have been tied up. But we're still going to be able to say this person was tied up or confined in some way. When we're talking about liquid burns, we're usually talking about coffee or water. Okay, and then there's really two types of burns even with that. Most of the time when you're talking about a liquid burn, it is just that sudden instant frustration, just going that, ah! And they'll throw a cup or a glass of a hot liquid at the child or the adult. It's going to look like an amoeba. It's going to be a splash type of burn. Okay? But there are some times, and we see it more with child abuse than we see it with dependent adult abuse, we'll see that a body part is grabbed and dunked. You know, it might be a hand, you know, dunked into a hot liquid, and it's going to look like they're wearing a glove of burn, because this surface will all be burned and there will be a straight line at the depth of the liquid. Dependent adults, sometimes we'll see a hand that's burned like that. You know, sometimes with children we will see that it's both feet, that a child has been dunked into especially hot bath water. You know, and it's going to be the same thing. It's going to look like they're wearing a short stocking. The whole foot will be burned. There will be a straight line, which is the depth of the liquid. If we see that in an adult, generally it's because they've stepped into the water rather than a deliberate action. And then likewise with liquid burns. With children, we don't see it in adults just because of size. If you have a child that's a chronic bedwetter, or they're having the caretakers are having problems toilet training, sometimes you will see a child that is bent in a knee-chest type of position. They're V'd and dunked bottom first into a hot liquid, usually water. And once again, there's going to be that straight line, the depth of the liquid. So with burns, you usually always can tell what was used, what happened with that person. When we're talking about gags, the purpose of gagging somebody is to shut them up. Okay, first of all, if you plan to gag me, you're going to have to catch me first. Then you're going to have to tie me up, because I'm going to fight with everything I have to keep you from doing that. You know, and in addition to that, the gag's got to be tight enough to get the job done, because I can still teeth us clear up. And when it reaches the part that I can't talk anymore, you've gotten the job done. I have been gagged to shut me up. But a lot of times we don't think, okay, so what kind of damage could that cause? How many of you actually pay attention to anybody's tongue when you're talking to them? I know if they have a stud in the middle of it, I do. I'm totally fascinated by their tongue because they have the stud in the middle of it. But other than that, unless we're in a dental field or we're looking down the throat, we're using a tongue depressor, something like that, most of us don't think about tongues. They just are there. And so because we don't think about tongues, we may miss an important cue. If you have a popcorn hull caught in your teeth, I don't know why we don't get out dental floss first. Instead, we work our tongue and work our tongue till it's sore. Same thing. If I can't fight, if I can't get rid of the gag any other way, I will use my tongue to the point there will usually be a straight line bruise across the tongue. There may be bruises across one earlobe, both earlobes. And generally, there's missing hair in the back. Because when the perpetrator ties it, they're not going to say, hey, Di, could you lift your hair out of the way? They're just not going to care. They're going to tie the gag, and my hair's going to be in the knot. When they take off the gag, they'll yank it off. There will go the hair, so I'm missing some hair in the back. May catch an earring, I may have a torn earlobe. But definitely the corners of my mouth are at risk just by tying the gag, the tightness of it. And most of the time, especially as adults, when we have a problem with the corner of our mouth, generally it's because it's wintertime in Iowa and the humidity's down. So we don't think outside of that box about what else could cause that kind of damage. And a gag will do that. It'll cause cuts and tearing on the sides of the mouth. When we look up farther up on the scale, and we're going to jump up to the middle of it, we're talking about hypothermia. Hypothermia, low body temperature. And sometimes that's the kid's fault. Sometimes that's not abusive at all. My office is about 2 blocks away from a major high school. And as soon as it hits 40 degrees outside, every kid at the bus stop is wearing flip-flops, short shorts, a tank top, and a cell phone. It's 40 degrees out. That is cold. But for them, it's a deliberate behavior because they get a group hug. They're all standing around the bus stop. So if their body temperature goes down, that's really their fault. That's not the fault of a caregiver. As far as abusive action is concerned with child abuse and low body temperature, I used to volunteer for a school in the morning at breakfast time before I would go to work. It was a great time of the morning to meet kids just, fresh out of bed, all bubbly and ready for a day. When I got there one morning, there was this little 6-year-old. She was sitting in the cafeteria, and they had her all wrapped up in a blanket, and she still was shivering. When the custodian got to school that morning, he found this little girl under a bush in front of the school. Now, it was winter time. She was actually lying on a snowdrift. There were no leaves on the bush. So fortunately,